Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing big summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Usually, when we examine the lives of historical leaders, the individuals who build sprawling institutions and speak to thousands in these really prestigious venues, we kind of expect a certain trajectory.
Right. Yeah, like a pristine academic background or a carefully cultivated reputation.
Exactly. We look for extensive theological training and this very predictable, steady climb up the institutional ladder.
Which is pretty much the standard narrative of influence, especially in late 19th and early 20th century religious life. The big figures of that era, they were almost always defined by their pedigree, right? Like their pulpits and their proximity to power.
Yeah, but today we are going to look at two radically different images of the exact same man. And I really want you to hold both of these images in your mind.
Okay, let's set the scene.
So in the first image, you have a man standing on the stage of the Royal Albert Hall in London. Arguably one of the most famous and culturally intimidating venues on earth.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge deal.
And he's a celebrated leader. He's a pioneer who spearheaded a massive movement, personally establishing or helping to create 68 distinct rescue missions.
Wow, 68. That's no small feat.
Not at all. And he's standing there, holding thousands of people, including some of the most prominent religious figures of his day, just absolutely spellbound.
So in this image, he is basically operating at the absolute pinnacle of global influence, right? Like within the sphere of urban missiology and evangelism, he is at the very top.
Right. Now look at the second image. Same man. Only this time, he is in the darkest, most unforgiving slums of 1890s Chicago.
A total contrast.
Completely. He actually describes himself as a quote-unquote bum. He is severely, hopelessly addicted to alcohol, completely destitute, and surviving on the brutal winter streets without a coat.
Just horrifying conditions.
And he is actively planning to take his own life. Like it is a total, devastating, inescapable rock bottom.
Yeah, it's a portrait of total systemic and personal collapse. And I think the distance between those two realities, between the suicidal addict in the Chicago gutter and the celebrated orator at the Royal Albert Hall, that's the territory we're exploring today.
Exactly. So today's deep dive draws from a truly remarkable primary source. We're examining excerpts from the autobiography titled These 40 Years by Melvin E. Trotter, D.D., alongside a detailed historical chronology of his ministries.
And that legacy stands well over a century, which is just incredible.
It really is. So our mission for this deep dive is to explore the grit, the profoundly unconventional tactics, and the radical compassion of the early 20th century city rescue mission movement, all through Mel Trotter's eyes. We really want to discover how radical grace can create unstoppable ripples of change.
It's such a compelling story.
Okay, let's unpack this. How does a man go from the absolute edge of the abyss to becoming a compelling, world-renowned public speaker almost overnight? Let's look at the years 1897 to 1900.
Well, the sheer velocity of the transformation is what really demands our attention here. We are looking at Mel Trotter, a man completely devoid of hope.
Right.
But then on January 19th, 1897, his entire trajectory shifts. He walks into the Pacific Garden Mission in Chicago.
Which was a major hub at the time, right?
Oh, totally. For context, Pacific Garden was an incredibly prominent rescue mission. It was essentially ground zero for a certain brand of muscular urban evangelism. And at the time, it was under the leadership of a man named Harry Monroe.
Right. So Trotter walks in completely desperate, and the text notes he has this immediate, profound conversion experience. But I think the crucial element here is that it wasn't just, a private internal moment of spiritual clarity.
No, not at all. He doesn't just have a moment and go home.
Exactly. He instantly becomes integrated into the daily operational fabric of that mission. Harry Monroe takes him right under his wing.
Yeah.
The autobiography actually describes Trotter as becoming Harry's Timothy, which is a reference to the biblical mentor-mentee relationship.
Right, making Harry his Paul. And the practical application of that mentorship is super vital for understanding Trotter's later methodology.
How so?
Well, Trotter doesn't retreat. He doesn't go off to a seminary for 4 years to study theoretical theology or, parse Greek verbs. Instead, he gets a job in a local barbershop to secure his basic physical survival.
Just grinding it out.
Yeah, and then he spends every single night immersed in the mission. He could play the guitar a bit, he could sing, but the real core of his theological education was getting up and giving his testimony nightly.
Man, think about the pedagogical power of that. I almost view this like a superhero origin story, honestly. But instead of falling into a vat of radioactive chemicals, Trotter falls into absolute despair.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, and his superpower basically becomes this radical, undeniable empathy for the broken. Because when you stand in front of a room full of people who are freezing, addicted, and starving, and you can look them right in the eye and say, hey, I was exactly where you were sitting just a few weeks ago.
Oh, the impact must have been electric. It completely shatters the artificial barrier between the pulpit and the pew.
Absolutely.
And this really brings us to the psychological and spiritual mechanics of what we'd call the wounded healer. Trotter was engaging in incarnational ministry.
Right, being right there in the flesh with them.
Exactly, because in the late 19th century urban slum, trust was practically non-existent. The working poor and the destitute viewed the institutional church with intense suspicion.
I mean, they often saw it as an extension of the wealthy elite who controlled the factories and the boarding houses, right?
Spot on. If a classically trained minister in a pristine suit came in to preach, the message was almost immediately filtered through layers of class resentment. But Trotter, he spoke from the gutter he had literally just crawled out of.
He had absolute, unquestionable street credibility. And by delivering his testimony every single night, he's basically taking a masterclass in public speaking through trial by fire.
Learning on the job in the most intense way possible.
Yeah. He's learning in real time what actually connects with a hardened audience. He's figuring out how to read the tension in a room, how to deploy humor to diffuse hostility, and how to project raw sincerity.
And that immediate immersion in the mission culture forged not just his communication style, but his whole operational DNA. He was observing firsthand how Harry Monroe navigated the chaotic reality of a rescue mission.
Because it wasn't a quiet Sunday service.
Far from it. He saw how to handle disruptive, heavily intoxicated individuals, how to manage the logistics of feeding massive crowds, and critically, how to balance immense compassion with necessary boundaries.
Which has such a direct application for anyone listening right now who is engaged in leadership or ministry.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how often do you discount someone's potential, or perhaps even discount your own, because of a messy past?
We do it all the time. We have this tendency to view past failures or addictions or struggles as permanent disqualifiers for leadership.
Right. But in this specific context, that extreme vulnerability and that intimate knowledge of human failure was the exact unique qualification needed to connect with others.
Because the most valuable expertise isn't always theoretical. Frequently, it is experiential survival. The institutional church had the theology, sure, but Trotter had the lived experience of the text.
And that raw, street-level credibility, which was forged right in the crucible of the Pacific Garden Mission, is exactly what a group of businessmen in a neighboring state were desperately looking for just 3 years later.
Which is an incredibly fast turnaround.
It is. So let's look at what happens in January 1900, which leads to the birth of the Grand Rapids City Rescue Mission. We have this committee of prominent businessmen in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The text specifically names Thomas M. Peck, who was a wealthy druggist, and Deacon Loomis.
Right, these guys recognize a glaring operational failure in their city. They have a severe problem with urban poverty, transient workers, and addiction. And they see that the traditional churches are completely failing to reach these populations.
They just aren't equipped for it.
Exactly. So to address this, they invite Harry Monroe from Chicago to basically demonstrate how a rescue mission actually functions.
And Monroe doesn't just show up with a PowerPoint, obviously.
No, he doesn't bring a polished presentation at all. He brings the physical evidence of the work. He brings his converted, quote-unquote, bums.
I love that. Show, don't tell.
Exactly. He brings Tom Sullivan, a man who had spent 16 years in the penitentiary, and he brings Mel Trotter. And they hold meetings across various venues in Grand Rapids, putting the raw, transformative power of the mission on full display.
And the businessmen are totally convinced. They immediately raise $1,100.
Which was a very significant capital investment in 1900.
Oh, yeah, huge money. They raise it to open a mission in Grand Rapids. But the critical pivot is who they choose to run it. They don't hire a seasoned pastor. They don't even hire Harry Monroe.
No, they choose Mel Trotter. A man who, by the text's own admission, had never run a mission meeting in his life.
It is a massive organizational gamble. I mean, they secure a building at 95 Canal Street, which was an area known for saloons, and vice later it became Lower Monroe Avenue.
Right, and the autobiography provides this deeply grounded historical perspective of those early days through the eyes of a character named Jerry the cop.
Yes, the police officer assigned to that specific beat. Jerry's perspective is fascinating because it really highlights the sheer physical danger of the enterprise.
Jerry fully expected this new mission to be completely dismantled, right?
He did. He assumed that the first night, Mel didn't have a heavy police presence. The local toughs and the saloon patrons would literally tear the building apart.
Because the environment was incredibly volatile. I mean, they were packing people into this small space gamblers, men fresh out of jail, heavily intoxicated individuals who were just looking to escape the cold. The threat of physical violence was constant.
But Trotter had a highly specific, very physical method of crowd control. The text notes that Mel was, quote-unquote, husky.
Which is such a polite 1900s way of saying he was built like a tank.
Exactly. So during the service, while the crowd was singing from the song sheet, specifically hymn number 6, more about Jesus, a brawl might break out in the back row.
As one does during a hymn.
Right. And Mel wouldn't stop the service to call for the police. He would simply tell the organist, Miss Smith, to keep playing. Then he'd walk down the aisle, physically grab the brawler by the scruff of the neck, and just throw him out the front door into the street.
Just toss him right out.
Yep. Dust off his hands, walk back to the front, and pick up the sermon right where he left off. He even recruited his brother, George, who was also a recent convert and equally husky, to serve as the mission's bouncer.
It's such a wild visual.
Wait, I have to pause here, because the superintendent, the spiritual leader of the organization, is physically wrestling people out of the building mid-hymn. That sounds like a saloon brawl with a Christian soundtrack.
It really does.
It completely violates our modern sensibilities of what a safe or pastoral environment should look like.
It does, and that tension is vital to understand here. We really have to strip away our sanitized contemporary notions of polite Sunday morning ecclesiology.
Right, this wasn't a suburban megachurch.
Exactly. This was the absolute front line of urban desperation. The businessmen who hired Trotter and Loomis, they understood the sociology of the Canal Street slums. The text uses a brilliant, highly specific term to describe why they hired Trotter. They said he was, quote-unquote, bridle-wise.
Like a horse that knows how to respond to the reins.
Precisely. In the context of 1900s urban poverty, being bridle-wise meant you intuitively understood the unspoken rules of the street, you understood the slang, the posturing, the threats, and the raw physical realities of the environment.
Which you couldn't just learn from a book.
No way. If Peck and Loomis had installed a gentle, academically trained minister from a prosperous suburb in that room at 95 Canal Street, the crowd would have eaten him alive.
Literally.
They required a leader who could articulate divine grace eloquently, sure, but who was also entirely capable of physically defending the congregation. Trotter spoke the native language of the desperate, both verbally and physically.
So the mission was a specialized intervention for a very specialized environment. And this gritty physical reality at Canal Street highlights how rescue missions fundamentally differed from the traditional church model of the era.
They were playing a completely different game.
Yeah, and the source text actually provides a fascinating taxonomy of the different types of missions that were being built. I mean, they weren't just throwing up buildings randomly. They were categorizing the suffering and building specific structures to address it.
It really represents a highly strategic deployment of resources. The leaders of the rescue mission movement recognized that, quote-unquote, the poor were not a monolith.
Right.
Different environments created distinct types of marginalization, and therefore they required distinct types of interventions.
Let's break down Trotter's categories, because they reveal a lot about the societal fractures of the time. First, he outlines slum missions. He points to Jerry McCauley's famous mission in New York, located on Water Street right under the Brooklyn Bridge.
So these are right in the thick of it.
Exactly. Yeah. Planted directly in the center of the chaos. They're surrounded by lodging houses, pawn shops, and barrel houses, often adjacent to red light districts. Trotter actually notes these are areas where, quote, bad men and women can live there, with no questions asked.
And those operations ran every single day and night.
Every day, every night. And they practically always offered a quote-unquote feed or a meal.
Okay, and then he identifies the family missions. And this category is super crucial because it highlights a massive socioeconomic shift. The text describes a phenomenon of ecclesial abandonment where established, wealthy churches were literally fleeing urban neighborhoods.
Fleeing for the suburbs, basically.
Right. It provides this staggering statistic. In one specific section of New York, 88 churches moved uptown to more affluent areas, while simultaneously 500,000 additional people moved into that very same district.
Wow.
In Philadelphia, 55 churches moved out while 225,000 people moved in.
That is a phenomenal demographic shift. You have this massive influx of humanity, mostly poor, working-class immigrants and rural migrants, flooding into the city centers to work in the factories. And the institutional church is just packing up its stained glass and retreating to safety.
Yep, the safety of the wealthy suburbs. And the family mission was designed to step into that massive, gaping void.
How did they do that practically?
Well, they would take over abandoned store buildings or even purchase the empty churches left behind by the fleeing denominations. And they would offer Sunday schools, mothers' meetings, and clothes rooms.
So they became the social and spiritual safety net for families that the established church had completely abandoned.
Exactly. Then, Trotter lists industrial missions. These were incredibly pragmatic. They featured things like wood yards, broom factories, and repair shops.
Oh, so they tied in labor.
Right. The concept was that people could come in, perform manual labor, and literally earn their bed and meals while simultaneously learning a trade and maintaining their dignity.
That's brilliant. Followed by the sailors or seamen's missions. And these were positioned with military precision in major ports like Cleveland, Buffalo, or San Francisco.
Catching them right off the boat.
Literally. Their entire operational goal was interception. They wanted to catch sailors the moment they stepped off the boat with their paychecks, before the local saloons, gambling houses, and brothels could drain their pockets and ruin their lives.
It's all about strategic location.
Yeah. And finally, he details denominational or women's missions, specifically highlighting the Crittenden homes. These were dedicated to rescuing and preventing the exploitation of what the era termed fallen women, providing a safe harbor and an alternative to the streets.
It's a very comprehensive network.
It is. Looking at this taxonomy, the level of strategic specialization is incredible. It's like you wouldn't send a severe trauma patient to a podiatrist. Similarly, the rescue mission movement didn't just offer a generic one-size-fits-all spiritual platitude. They built highly targeted clinics for specific societal wounds.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture of missiology, it underscores a profound theological shift toward incarnational presence. The core value was meeting people exactly where they were, not where polite society wished they would be.
They weren't asking them to clean up first.
Exactly. They didn't demand that a starving man sit through a theological lecture on justification before handing him a piece of bread. The text details how these missions offer deeply practical, holistic help.
Like what kind of help?
Well, women were fumigating and repairing old, lice-infested clothing. They were organizing sewing circles to teach skills. They were even contracting doctors from the District Nurses Association to be on call for the missions.
Wow. So the spiritual message of salvation was inextricably intertwined with tangible, physical salvation from the elements and disease.
Exactly. You can't minister to the soul if the body is dying of exposure.
Which really challenges our modern paradigms. I mean, consider the institutions today, whether we're talking about retail, healthcare networks, or even community centers. There is still a prevalent phenomenon of retreating from the most difficult, impoverished, unprofitable areas.
Food deserts, pharmacy deserts, it's the exact same dynamic.
Right. It forces you as a listener to look at your own community or industry. Are there voids right now that require a completely new, specialized, on-the-ground approach, rather than just retreating to spaces that are safe, clean, and profitable?
It's a tough question. And identifying the void and constructing the specialized facility was really only the first step.
Sure, building it is one thing.
Right. The far more difficult challenge was convincing a deeply skeptical, often intoxicated, and thoroughly marginalized population to actually walk through the doors of the mission.
And a polite little sandwich board on the sidewalk wasn't going to cut it. Which brings us to Trotter's methods of unconventional evangelism on the front lines.
This is where his brilliance really shines.
It is. Trotter operated under a very specific biblical mandate, which he frequently quoted, by all means to save some. And his interpretation of all means was incredibly aggressive, highly creative, and totally outside the box.
He understood that he had to be a disruptor. The standard methods of invitation were just useless in the saloon districts.
Let's examine his use of gospel wagons. Because this wasn't just a guy standing on a soapbox yelling at passersby.
Oh, far from it.
Where Trotter would deploy a massive wagon crewed by nearly 20 men. They outfitted it with a portable organ, a choir of excellent singers, and, this is the detail that gets me, the wagon was drawn by a pair of massive gray stallions weighing a combined 3,200 pounds.
It's pure spectacle.
They would pull this sheer physical spectacle right into the parks, the busy streets, and specifically into the saloon districts on Saturday nights, which were obviously the most volatile nights of the week.
It was a calculated shock and awe campaign designed to monopolize attention. I mean, you simply could not ignore 3,200 pounds of horse muscle and a 20-man choir pulling up directly outside your local bar.
Nope, you really couldn't.
And this disruptive tactic yielded measurable results. The text shares a specific narrative about a saloon keeper and his wife who ran a boarding house over on Kent Street. They approach the gospel wagon while it is stationed in front of Monument Park.
They hear the music, they hear the testimonies, and this saloon keeper experiences a profound conversion right there on the street corner.
But the impact doesn't remain isolated, which is the key.
Right. He raises his hand, commits to a new life, and promises Trotter he will be at the mission that night. And true to his word, he comes. But he brings his wife, his own children, and the residents of his boarding house.
Incredible.
The text notes that almost the entire boarding house was saved as a direct result of that single disruptive street intervention.
That narrative just perfectly illustrates the compounding return of frontline evangelism.
Yeah.
But Trotter's innovation extended far beyond the wagons. We must look at his signboard evangelism.
Yes. Which introduces us to one of the most fascinating figures in the autobiography, Casey Vanderjagt.
Casey's such a character.
He really is. Casey was a notorious local bootlegger. He owned and operated a fleet of taxi cabs that catered specifically to the criminal element of the city, shuttling bad men to bad places. He was essentially the logistics manager for localized vice.
But then Trotter sets up a temporary tabernacle down in Burton Heights, and on the very first night, Casey the bootlegger walks in and gets converted.
Just like that.
Just like that. And this is where Trotter's brilliance for organizational leadership shines. He possessed an incredible ability to recognize and repurpose talent.
Rather than discarding it.
Exactly. After his conversion, Casey sells his fleet of taxis and buys a coal truck to make an honest living. But he is completely on fire with his new faith. Now, Casey was functionally illiterate. He couldn't read or write very well. But the mission had started a small initiative, painting catchy mottos on fences and culverts. Phrases like, Jesus saves, or get right with God. Or, my personal favorite, the incredibly evocative and psychologically piercing question, how long since you wrote Mother?
I love that specific phrase. It completely bypasses intellectual defenses and hits you right in the emotional guilt center. It's brilliant psychological marketing.
It really is. But Casey, despite his illiteracy, looks at this small initiative and decides to scale it massively. He takes the exact logistical networking skills he used to run an illegal bootlegging empire and applies them to roadside evangelism.
That is amazing.
He coordinates the entire supply chain. He gets one businessman to donate posts, another to donate lumber, another to supply paint, and he uses his own time and his coal truck to construct these massive $600 road signs, which was a small fortune at the time, all across the state of Michigan.
He literally engaged in asset reclamation. He took the operational genius of a criminal enterprise and baptized it into a statewide billboard campaign. It's unbelievable.
It shows how practical Trotter's vision was.
And Trotter's disruptive methods also included what he called shop work. They didn't wait for the workers to come to them. They went directly into the factories at noon to hold meetings. The text even includes a poem written by a factory worker about the mission, which had taken over the old Smith's Opera House.
And that poem is a vital piece of sociological evidence because it captures the transformation of physical space.
Oh, so?
Well, it explicitly notes that the Opera House used to be a place, quote, where the devil had charge complete, end quote. A place of secular, perhaps unsavory entertainment. But under Trotter's leadership, it was reclaimed.
It completely changed the atmosphere of the venue.
Yes. The poem lists the cast of characters. A man named Hermanson who played the piano so fast he seemed to have more than 10 fingers, a big, good-natured fellow nicknamed Ham who led the solos, and Mel Trotter preaching sermons that were devoid of cheap platitudes, delivering raw, powerful truths.
But I want to push back on this entire methodology for a moment.
Okay, let's hear it.
When you are using giant 3,200-pound stallions, when you are painting emotionally manipulative phrases on bridges, when you are yelling outside of saloons and taking over opera houses, isn't there a severe risk of this just becoming a circus? Doesn't the spectacle potentially cheapen the profound nature of the message?
It is a valid critique for sure, but we must understand the environment. Trotter was not the least bit interested in Victorian decorum because Victorian decorum had entirely failed the slums.
It wasn't saving anybody.
Exactly. He was fighting what he viewed as a literal high-stakes battle for both the eternal souls and the immediate physical survival of these individuals. Theological precision and quiet reverence do not save a man who is freezing to death in an alley after drinking away his week's wages.
That's a grim but true point.
Spectacle, however, gets his attention. It interrupts his destructive pattern. Trotter was perfectly willing to be loud, unrefined, and disruptive because the lethality of the environment demanded it. Leveraging Casey the bootlegger's questionable logistical past wasn't an ethical compromise. It was a pragmatic necessity to reach people the polite church refused to touch.
That makes total sense. That willingness to be entirely unrefined, to prioritize genuine connection and attention over perfect, polished presentation. It wasn't just a marketing tactic. It was the very essence of Mel Trotter's personal brand as a leader.
Right down to his core.
Yeah. And this becomes spectacularly evident when we look at how he exported that exact same raw, unvarnished style all the way across the Atlantic Ocean.
This creates one of the most phenomenal cultural juxtapositions in the entire text.
Let's set the stage for it. The year is 1937. Trotter is invited to Great Britain to participate in the D.L. Moody Centenary celebrations. The account is actually provided by Dr. Harry Ironside, who traveled with him.
And the climax of this trip is a speaking engagement at the Royal Albert Hall in London.
Right. And the Royal Albert Hall is the absolute epitome of high culture. It is incredibly proper, very stiff upper lip, filled with high society, prominent theologians, and civic leaders.
Not exactly his usual Canal Street crowd.
Not at all. And Trotter, this guy who learned to preach while throwing brawlers out of a slum mission, is genuinely nervous. He's been extensively warned by the British organizers about his quote-unquote correct diction.
They essentially told him, hey, your American slang and your greedy colloquialisms are not going to fly with this highly sophisticated, educated British audience.
And Ironside notes that initially Trotter internalized these warnings. When he started his address, his approach was stilted and unnatural. He was attempting to play the part of the polished, traditional orator.
And in doing so, he lost his unique power. He was functionally paralyzed by trying to be proper.
Exactly. But then, as Ironside describes it, something shifted. He quote-unquote got going. He completely abandoned the warnings, dropped the facade, and launched into his authentic, inimitable, street-level style.
And the specific anecdote the text gives is absolute gold.
It's so funny. Right there on the stage of the Royal Albert Hall, in the middle of this passionate sermon, Trotter is referencing the biblical narrative of Lot's wife, who turned into a pillar of salt. And he shouts to this massive crowd of incredibly proper Brits, "Remember Lot's wife. Don't you be like that woman. She rubbered and was seasoned forever."
She rubbered. I mean, he's using an American slang term for rubbernecking, turning your head to stare at something you shouldn't be looking at.
And the audience literally gasps. It is such an incredibly jarring, folksy, lowbrow Americanism to drop in that venue.
Completely out of left field for them.
And Trotter immediately realizes his slip-up. He stops, looks out this shocked, silent crowd, and yells, "You'll get that by freight later." Meaning, you'll figure out the joke eventually once it ships across the ocean.
The tension in the room at that moment must have been incredibly thick.
Oh, you could probably cut it with a knife.
But then Dr. G. Campbell Morgan, who was a highly respected, very proper British theologian, sitting right on the platform, bursts into loud, unmistakable laughter.
That cracks up.
Yeah, and that laughter acts as a permission slip for the rest of the audience. The tension completely breaks, the crowd is convulsed with good humor, and Trotter sails through the rest of the sermon with total command of the room.
And the results were staggering. When he finally gave the invitation, nearly 30 people came forward. Ironside explicitly notes that Trotter was gifted above many of his contemporaries in bringing people to a definitive decision, far surpassing the results of the more formal, academically trained speakers on the program.
What is fascinating here is the undeniable power of unapologetic authenticity. Trotter didn't attempt to hide his past or sanitize his origin.
He leaned into them.
He really did. He never presented himself as an intellectual giant or a theological scholar. He presented himself solely as a man redeemed from a drunkard's doom.
Right.
In a religious culture dominated by stiff, highly formalized, manuscript-driven oratory, his raw, unpretentious vulnerability pierced right through the cultural and intellectual armor of that British audience. They ultimately didn't care about his grammar or his slang because they were transfixed by his reality.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If you read the epilogue of the text, There's a detail that perfectly highlights the profound integrity of his authenticity.
Oh, the Chautauqua offer.
Yes, because Trotter was such a captivating, unique speaker, he was approached by a Chautauqua management group. Now, for context, the Chautauqua circuit was basically the premium secular lecture and entertainment tour of the era.
It was where you went to make serious money and build fame.
Absolutely. They offered him thousands of dollars, which was an absolute fortune at the time, to go on the lecture circuit, tell his thrilling life story, and shuffle a few of the old card tricks he used to do when he was a gambler in the slums.
His response was immediate and absolute. He flatly refused.
He turned it down cold. I mean, I want to pause and look at the profound tension there. On one hand, Trotter uses his dark, traumatic past every single night to relate to the broken man in his mission. He weaponizes his own history for empathy and connection.
Right, it's his main tool.
But the very moment someone offers to pay him to commodify that past, to turn his trauma into a cheap parlor trick, a piece of paid entertainment for curious, wealthy audiences, he draws a hard, immovable line.
He refused to let his ego or his wallet redirect his purpose.
Exactly. He insisted on remaining what the text calls a specialist in soul winning.
That refusal requires incredible internal grounding. Trotter implicitly understood a vital leadership principle. If he commodified his past for secular entertainment, he would instantly lose the spiritual authority that allowed him to connect with the desperate people at the mission.
He would become a performer instead of a rescuer.
Exactly. He would become an actor playing a part rather than a rescuer throwing a lifeline. But we also must understand the profound cost of that grounding.
Because it wasn't easy.
No. Retaining that level of unpretentious vulnerability meant he couldn't put up emotional walls. It meant keeping his heart wide open to intense pain, both from the harrowing cases he dealt with nightly on the mission floor and from profound personal tragedy.
Which perfectly transitions us to the darker reality of his life. Because if you read just the first half of this deep dive or just look at the highlights, you might think Trotter's life was just one long, victorious reel of miraculous conversions, roaring success, and standing ovations.
But the autobiography is remarkably, painfully transparent about the darkness.
It really is.
The emotional toll of this specific type of incarnational work is almost unimaginable. Trotter experienced a devastating wave of personal loss. In a very compressed period, he lost his father, his mother, and 3 of his sisters.
Just staggering grief.
Yeah, he writes with raw honesty that it seemed he could not bear it, that the heavens seemed like brass, and he was intensely tempted to end it all again. The shadow of his former suicidal ideation returned.
And on top of that crushing personal grief, he faced a vicious public professional attack. From January to September of 1922, he was dragged through the court system on what he simply calls a horrible charge.
The text doesn't dwell on the salacious details of the accusation, does it?
No, it doesn't. But it clearly notes that he was thoroughly and legally vindicated by the decree. Yet even with absolute vindication, the psychological damage was done. He felt like a marked man walking around feeling the whispers and the suspicion of the world on him.
And the most incredible part is that simultaneously, while carrying this crushing personal grief and enduring a public trial, he is still the superintendent of the mission.
He still has to show up.
Right. He is still required to stand on that platform and face the absolute worst of human suffering and degradation every single night.
And the story that really encapsulates the sheer grit required to endure this is the story of Tommy Hogan.
This is a tough one.
It is. The text sets this scene during a period when Trotter was filling in back at the Pacific Garden Mission in Chicago. A woman crawls out of the darkness and stops right in front of them. She's from the Pogie, which was the street slang for the county house out at Dunning.
And the physical description Trotter provides is absolutely brutal. It is entirely unvarnished.
Yeah, it's hard to read.
It is a portrait of complete physical decay before the advent of modern antibiotics or clinical rehab. Trotter describes her as the worst case he had ever seen. She was a severe opium fiend.
Her clothing consisted of a single-piece brown denim dress, shoes, but no stockings. She had fallen and cut her head, blood was running down her face, and her red hair was heavily matted.
And it gets worse.
It does. She was literally covered from head to toe in ulcers and open sores caused by using a dirty, shared hypodermic machine. She was even chewing tobacco. Trotter admits in the text that to describe her condition further would be purely repulsive.
And they bring her into the mission. She is so far gone, so heavily sedated by the opium, that even the loud singing and the chaotic environment couldn't keep her awake.
So what do they do?
Well, Trotter's colleague, a man named John, literally had to stand next to her with a 2.5-foot walnut stick, which was the pole they used to turn on the gas lights, and physically poke her repeatedly just to keep her conscious enough to hear the message.
Just poking her with a stick so she wouldn't nod off.
Yes, but she listens. And she experiences this miraculous conversion. She later testified that she had been handicapped by morphine addiction for over 8 years and had been pronounced completely incurable by leading medical specialists. But in that mission, she was saved.
That narrative forces us to confront a very difficult question about human endurance and systemic care.
I know what you're going to ask.
I'm going to ask it. When you are dealing with the most extreme, physically repulsive, deeply entrenched cases of addiction every single night, and simultaneously, you are facing a targeted, exhausting public lawsuit, and you are actively grieving the death of almost your entire immediate family.
Right.
How do you not just become totally irredeemably cynical? How do you not just lock the heavy wooden doors of the mission, say, I've done enough for these people, and just quit?
It is the central burning question of long-term social work and ministry. Burnout and cynicism are the occupational hazards of compassion. But the text gives us Trotter's exact answer.
What was his secret?
He points to a deep, sustaining reliance on what he calls the Comforter, the Holy Ghost. He viewed his body as a literal temple for this Comforter, who became his internal stay and support. That is the theological resilience.
Makes sense.
But there is also a profound psychological framework at play here, which Trotter explicitly states and operates from.
Yes. He states a core belief that I think serves as the bedrock of his entire worldview and methodology. He says, quote, "There is no drunkard who wants to be one. They still have hope that there is a way out."
That is a revolutionary psychological stance for the year 1900, and frankly, it remains revolutionary today. Trotter completely rejected the prevalent societal idea that addiction was a permanent moral failing or a chosen lifestyle of degeneracy.
He didn't see it as their identity.
Exactly. He believed that beneath the dirt, beneath the violence, beneath the festering ulcers of the hypodermic needle, there was an image bearer of God who was trapped, who hated their chains, and who desperately wanted to be free.
And when you truly fundamentally believe that about people, that their core desire is for freedom, not degradation, it shields you from cynicism. You realize you aren't fighting them, you are fighting the chains holding them.
Trotter referred to this holistic approach as the double cure, saving the eternal soul while simultaneously healing the physical reality of the person.
That unyielding, almost stubborn belief in the inherent dignity and potential of every single person. It didn't just save individuals like Tommy Hogan or Casey the Bootlegger. It created an immense institutional momentum.
It built a legacy that long outlasted Trotter himself.
It did. And that brings us to the final phase of his life, the ripple effect and the continuing mission. Let's look at the sheer scale of the timeline provided in the historical chronology.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Trotter spent 40 years as the superintendent of the Grand Rapids mission, serving continuously until his passing in 1940. But he didn't just stay in his lane or focus solely on his own facility. He acted as a sort of national pinch hitter for the entire rescue mission movement.
He personally helped start or establish 68 other missions.
68. The timeline is absolutely packed with these interventions. There's the incredible story of Kalamazoo, Michigan, where a man named W.S. Colgrove was sent to start a work.
Oh, I love this story.
It's so good. They couldn't find a suitable available building in the city, so they literally bought out an active functioning saloon, whiskey and all.
And on dedication day, they didn't sell the stock to recoup their money. They poured all the whiskey straight out into the street gutters.
Right into the gutters.
Yeah.
And he traveled constantly, opening missions in Milwaukee, Detroit, and cities all over the country.
And we can trace the institutional evolution clearly through the chronology. The mission in Grand Rapids didn't remain static. It adapted to the changing sociological and medical needs of the 20th and 21st centuries.
So what happened after Trotter passed away?
Well, after he passes in 1940, the mission continues to expand and professionalize. In 1974, they acquired land for a children's day camp named Camp Meltromi.
Moving into youth support.
Right. In 1994, they initiated new specialized outreach programs, officially becoming a state of Michigan Center for Substance Abuse Services, or CSS treatment center. They purchased buildings specifically for a women and children shelter, recognizing that the demographics of urban poverty were shifting.
And fast forward to the 2000s, they're opening free dental and vision clinics, running a citywide center for publicly intoxicated individuals with licensed nurses on staff, and even opening retail thrift stores to generate sustainable community support.
It is a remarkable synthesis of organizational evolution and philosophical consistency. Think about the operational distance from 1900 to the 2010s. What started with Mel and his brother George literally throwing brawlers at the front door by the scruff of their necks evolved into a highly sophisticated, multi-million-dollar network.
A network of medical care clinics, professional substance abuse treatment centers, and specialized family shelters.
But the core philosophy, it remained absolutely identical. We get a powerful modern perspective in the text from Dennis Van Kampen, who served as the CEO of Mel Trotter Ministries in 2016.
Right, and he reflects on this specific continuity. He uses the concept of the ripples.
The pebble dropped in the pond.
Right, you drop a single stone into the water. In this historical narrative, the stone is a suicidal, destitute, alcohol-addicted man who stumbles out of the freezing Chicago winter into the Pacific Garden Mission in January 1897 and is saved by grace.
That one event creates a ripple.
And that ripple travels to Grand Rapids in 1900. It travels across the country to 68 different cities. It echoes out into the 1970s, providing a summer camp for impoverished kids. It echoes into the 1990s, giving battered women a safe shelter.
And well over a century later, it is an institution serving the hungry, homeless, and hurting in complex, medicalized ways that Trotter couldn't have possibly imagined.
Van Kampen explicitly states that the modern staff and volunteers are executing the exact same mandate Trotter did, seeking to look beyond the immediate physical appearance and the destructive behavior to see someone whom God has huge plans for.
The method's professionalized, sure. Nurses replaced men with walnut sticks, and clinical addiction treatment replaced physically bouncing people into the street. But the foundational lens of radical, incarnational compassion remained exactly the same.
Which makes me want to ask you, the listener, a direct question. Think about your own ripples. How often do we drastically underestimate the long-term compounding impact of our actions?
It's so easy to do.
It is. How might a single act of radical compassion in your life, maybe stepping in to mentor someone who is deeply struggling or refusing to give up on a family member, a colleague, or a member of your congregation that everyone else has labeled a hopeless case, how might that one act echo out?
You might not start 68 rescue missions, but you might fundamentally change the trajectory of family tree for the next century.
Exactly. It is the ultimate counter-narrative to a modern culture that demands immediate, highly visible return on investment. The ripple effect of grace requires immense patience and a steadfast belief that no act of intervention is ever wasted,
even if you never live to see the final shoreline that ripple reaches.
So what does this all mean for us today? We started this deep dive by looking at two contrasting images of Mel Trotter. The man in the Chicago gutter planning his own violent end, and the man at the Royal Albert Hall commanding the attention of the global religious elite.
Quite the journey.
The massive distance between those two images wasn't crossed by climbing a corporate ladder or by hiding his flaws or by conforming to the polite, sanitized expectations of Victorian society.
No, it was crossed through an unwavering commitment to the people that polite society had entirely discarded. He built a century-spanning empire of healing, not by seeking out the strong, the wealthy, or the influential, but by constantly, relentlessly searching for the broken.
And that leaves us with a final, provocative thought to mull over.
Yeah, think about this. Trotter built an empire of grace by constantly searching for the exact people society had deemed completely worthless. In our modern, hyper-optimized world, where we constantly measure ROI, operational efficiency, and clean metrics, who are the unlovables in our own communities, in our churches, or in our industries that we are quietly writing off as bad investments?
We like our diagnostics clean, like an X-ray, broken or not broken, worthy or unworthy.
But Trotter waded into the murky waters, the messiest, most dangerous parts of the human experience, and found the foundation for a movement. So what world-changing potential are we leaving on the table by refusing to look at the marginalized through that same lens of radical grace?
Such a powerful question to end on. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking beyond the surface, and keep seeking out the stories that challenge your perspective. We'll see you next time.